dicho buonasera quasi.
Buonasera, benissimo.
Perfecto. Embajador, en primer lugar, gracias siempre por tu hospitalidad, por convertir este edificio en el centro del Mediterráneo en cuanto a reflexión y a debate, desde luego, en nuestro ámbito. O sea que muchísimas gracias una vez más por la posibilidad de debatir en el IMED sobre... ¿Sí? Si no, no. Bueno, pues decía que después de decir buenas tardes, buena tarde o buonasera, agradecía al embajador Florenza su habilidad, su hospitalidad y sobre todo darnos ocasión otra vez para reflexionar sobre temas del Mediterráneo, que vuelve a estar de moda y que nunca deja de estar de moda el Mediterráneo. Se decía que después de la batalla de Lepanto el eje axial, el eje del mundo pasaba al Atlántico. Luego se decía que pasaba, efectivamente, que estamos y pasa a mar de China, pero la actualidad es muy tozuda, la realidad es muy tozuda y nos vuelve a llevar al ámbito mediterráneo como lugar en que convergen montones de cosas desde el punto de vista económico, cultural, de todo tipo, político, jurídico, religioso. En fin, el profesor Parsi nos hablará con mucho más autoridad que yo, pero yo siempre sostengo varias cosas. Una es la cuestión que todos sabemos entre el eje euroatlántico más Rusia y China, lo de India, que es una teoría que yo, de la que hace 4 años me parece un poco loco, pero finalmente cobra cuerpo, la India como país con superpotencia, el Ártico como ruta de navegación y luego el Sahel como lugar de escenarios por estos 25 productos esenciales, ¿no?, de los que todo está hecho. Desde aquí está el litio, el silicio, el coltán, en fin, estamos en un escenario geopolítico muy interesante, geoeconómico y geotecnológico, también con la guerra de la nanotecnología, con Taiwán en el centro como cetro del trono, y luego la física cuántica aplicada para desarrollar una AI que empezamos en Europa. Ya sabéis todos que ha habido esta cumbre hace pocos días en Londres y la AI empieza a ser regulada por la IACT de la Unión Europea, que teóricamente debería acabar hacia finales de año y que es el primer intento regulatorio. Hasta ahora ha sido todo preregulatorio, ¿no? Pero con mucha más autoridad que yo, por muchas cosas, en primer lugar porque es de Turín y es una ciudad a la que estoy yo muy ligado personalmente, a Turín, a Valdocco, a la zona de Dora, el Po, en fin.
En el centro de la ciudad.
En el centro de la ciudad, sí. Tenemos al profesor, y lo agradezco muchísimo que haya podido estar con nosotros, al profesor Parsi, que ha hecho mucha agenda. Él es profesor, vive entre Roma y Milán, que ya de por sí es un buen contraste cultural y permite comprender bien lo que significa la parte norte y sur de la ribera del Mediterráneo. Él es ordinario en la Cattolica de Milán, la Universidad Católica de Milán, pero al mismo tiempo tiene muchos encargos muy diversos. También ha dado clase en Lugano, también en Londres, en sus campos de investigación muy diversos, y van desde las relaciones transatlánticas, seguridad en el Medio Oriente, los cambios estructurales del sistema político internacional también, las relaciones entre la democracia y el mercado. Ha tenido conferencias en prácticamente las mejores universidades del mundo, en Princeton, en la Cornell, en San Anthony, en San Joseph, en fin, en muchas de todo el mundo. Forma parte del Grupo de Reflexión Estratégica del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores y Cooperación de Italia. Colabora ya a título, pero eso sería distinto, con Médicos Sin Fronteras en Italia, pero también forma parte de un lugar que es clave, que es de la London School of Economics, el LSE-IGS, que es el Centro para Democracia y Estrategia de la LSE de Londres. Y es socio, finalmente, fundador de la Sociedad para el Estudio de la Difusión de la Democracia. Finalmente, ya, casi por la actualidad, me permito destacar que es miembro del Comité de Garantía del Jardín de los Justos, porque, en fin, como decía antes, la realidad es muy tozuda y no se vuelve al lugar de origen, a la casilla de origen, y estamos casi otra vez en el año 47, diría yo, pero él con mucha más autoridad nos hablará de otros temas. Pero parece que volvamos otra vez al año 47 en una situación muy compleja en el Medio Oriente, sobre todo pues, por la tensión entre Palestina y Israel, provocada por Hamas estos días, con la respuesta de Israel. En fin, sería muy complejo, encontraríamos muchos pareceres, pero Pero bueno, al final la verdad acaba siendo, como decía Salvador Espriu, la veritat és un mirall esquinçat en 1000 trossos, no? Cadascú en junta y al final en catalán significaría que la verdad es como un espejo, ¿no? Que alguien ha tirado al suelo y al final hay muchos trocitos que uno va recomponiendo, ¿no? Yo creo que el papel del moderador siempre es pasar desapercibido y sin más dar sobre todo el foco a quien lo merece, que es el profesor Parsi. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted, muchas gracias a todos vosotros, a ustedes por la invitación en este lugar. En Barcelona es siempre muy bonito de llegar, en Barcelona, en España también, en Cataluña. Y lo siento mucho de no poder tener mi conferencia. Conferencia es una palabra demasiado relevante por lo que voy a decirle. En español, porque mi español es demasiado pobre y hace muchos años que no lo hablo más. Entonces tengo miedo de no decir, de no buscar palabras en la memoria. También porque soy viejo, ¿sabes? Tal vez Alzheimer, no sé. Entonces, le hablaré en inglés, que puede ser una tortura. Mi inglés es peor de mi español, pero vamos a descubrirlo muy pronto. La sola cosa que quiero decirle es que he cambiado muchas veces lo que tenía que decir en este lugar esta noche, esta tarde, porque claramente cuando empezamos a hablar de llegar aquí, muchas cosas no habían pasado. Y las cosas que están pasando en estas semanas eran imposibles de evitar de hablar de estas cosas, sino como tener un elefante en el lobby, ¿no? Entonces, lo que voy a hacer es intentar de poner la cuestión mediterránea en una cuestión más amplia, que es la del orden internacional liberal, liberal world order, que es alguien que voy a explicar qué es y luego cómo pasa que va a encontrar unos problemas particulares aquí. Bueno, I'm moved to English, that probably is worse, but I took my note in English, so prefer to follow my notes, okay? So thank you for coming to everybody, and let's start to try to define what is liberal world order. Liberal world order is many things, but we can say that the liberal world order is the particular shape that the US hegemony assumed after 1945. Inside the political project, which recalled the Wilsonian principles and all the tradition of liberal thought. It means that even if it's the shape of the US hegemony, the concepts that are inside the liberal world order are much older than the US hegemony. It's something that was made step by step in Europe, mainly Europe, since the Enlightenment. So the concept, the principles come from very from the past, even if the opportunity to realize this concept is very recent at the end of the day. While the immediate goal was to create an international arena ruled not only by force, but even by law, the final goal was to shape the international system as a domestic democratic system. So the idea to have an international system friendly toward democracies. This was the main idea of this conception of order. And this was a paramount change. If you think that in the past, till the Second World War, the few democracies that were in the system have in the international system normally an enemy and never an ally. The principles of international order were not the principles that were used inside democracies. So the idea was to try to make the world, to quote President Wilson, safe for democracies. This was the main idea. In some way, this entailed protecting the domestic social orders from the disrupting influence coming from the international arena, with war being, of course, the most disrupting. So the idea was, how can we protect domestic society and domestic democratic institutions from the waves that are coming from outside? And the two main storms, of course, were war. Imagine that this order was realized after the Second World War, and on the other hand, financial crisis. Financial crisis because the people that was sketching the order was thinking about the Great Crisis, the Great Depression, 1929, and they were the people that were trying to design the New Deal and the tentative to recovery American economy and then world economy from the Great Depression. So this was the idea: protect societies from the distracting effects of anarchical arena. And in conceptual terms, the liberal world order was a simple and brilliant structure founded on an idea based on 5 pillars: building a free, open international market to contain the excess of sovereignty and the logic of international anarchy. So not to try to put away sovereignty, but try to embed sovereignty, to avoid the excess of sovereignty. The second pillar was using state sovereignty to check and balance the excess of the market. Because the idea was that even the excess of the market can destroy the social order. The lesson of the 30s in the last century was very clear. So the point is how to manage these two forces that are really existing. You have not to invent. And the point is we have tried to use the two forces such in a rugby scrum, you know? In a rugby match, the scrum do that. The blue, the red, they don't want to cooperate, but the final result is cooperation. The scrum stay on. So the idea was to use the force of the market, to use the force of the state, sovereignty, to balance them and to make them cooperate one each other. Something completely very simple but very new. The point, of course, was how to make possible this kind of cooperation, because in the first globalization period, before the First World War, the two forces of state sovereignty and the international market were pulling on different sides. They were not cooperating together for maintaining the order. So the idea was we need something that forces these two forces to do that. And just in the same way, as happened in a rugby match, for making the two pack cooperate in making the screw, you need a referee. It's the referee that order, okay, stop, push, and go on and play again, make the ball again possible to play. And the idea of referee was, the first thing was international institutions. The great novelty of the order after the Second World War was the enormous amount of international institutions. This changed completely the architecture of the system. It was a rich, solid architecture of international institutions to make cooperation between states possible, reducing the security dilemma, and channeling the force of market and the force of state sovereignty, making their cooperation possible and profitable. It's not just the point to do something. It's the point that people have followed their own interest. So it's not enough to give the possibility of cooperation. You have to make the cooperation profitable. And this was the idea. The fourth pillar was including politically, economically, and culturally the lower classes to make popular and so reinforcing the liberal institution of market economy and representative democracy. The point was that looking at the experience of the century going from the middle of the 19th century toward the middle of the 20th century, what was clear to these people that were liberal, that were bourgeois, was that the liberal state was not able to be charming for lower classes. And was not charming because neither market nor representative democracy were something in which lower classes can find an opportunity. So the point was to make a mass market and to make a mass democracy. Inclusion. Inclusion was the answer to try to avoid the coming back of fascism and 1945 to face the danger of communism. And the fifth pillar was creating, as a consequence, a strong, sizable middle class, promised to be the backbone of the domestic, political, and economic system. I don't know what are your origins. I can hope for you that you are Grandes de España, but it's quite unlike. But the most of the people, of the common people like we are normally grandson of popular people. The so-called middle class, even the upper middle class, is made by people that were coming from peasants or workers. So the idea was include these people inside, make these people richer, make these people, give these people voice, give these people the opportunity to change the politics or the policies of the country, give these people instructions, transform these, how can I say, this pleb into people, okay? From people that are just a social demographic concept to people that are a political concept, like Senatus Populusque Romanus. If you look at these 5 pillars, we can consider that since the 80s to the middle of 2000, they were mainly facing domestic threats or intra-Western threats, based on the breaking of the balance between democracy and market. That was the hidden idea of this structure. The crisis of embedded liberalism. Embedded liberalism means, okay, we can have a capitalist market economy, but we have to consider that the market economy is embedded inside society. So have to serve society in some way, no? And is vinculated to the societies. And this idea of embedded liberalism was entering crisis in the 70s for some facts and for some idea. These threats made impossible to keep together state sovereignty, market economy, and international order. And the crisis was starting in the 70s, in a period that is very similar to the one we are living today, with the economy that is growing slowly, with possible energy crisis, with the war in the Med, the Kippur War in the 73, with wages that were not able to follow the inflation, high unemployment. So some terms of the crisis that we are facing today remind us this kind of old crisis. And as happens, when you are facing some troubles that you are not able to solve or to manage, you start to think, how can we manage new solutions for this kind of situation that we are not able to govern, to manage? And there's the theoretical answer to this crisis, in theoretical terms, was found in 3 main cultural streams. The first is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is not the evil. Neoliberalism is a word that today has been charged of a lot of ideological meaning. You can like or you can dislike. But at the end of the day, neoliberalism was the idea that was the idea that we have to reduce the weight of government. We have to make the market more free, freer market, to make the market free from all ties that impede the market to grow and to create richness. The idea of deregulation. This was one of the road that was pushing this change in the liberal world order. It's a change that was starting slowly and then produced a big change. The second row, in terms of cultural row, was ordoliberalism. Ordoliberalism is something a little different from neoliberalism. Ordoliberalism is the conception of liberalism that was thought in Germany and Austria between the two wars. And the people that were working on this idea moved away from Germany with the Nazi success, and go to Oxford and to Cambridge, and they bring with them ortho-liberalism and put in Anglo-Saxon sauce. The idea in ortho-liberalism is quite different from neoliberalism. The difference is that for the ortho-liberal school, market is an institution. It's not a natural thing existing freely. It's an institution. And an institution needs rules. So state and market have to cooperate. But the point in which is very close to neoliberalism is that we need the kind of rules that can let the market grow. So the good rules are the rules that are good for the market. And in this point, the two different cultural flows were touching one each other. The second point of contact was that they have a faith in the market as a structure that is able not just to be a solution for economic transactions, but even a solution for organizing social life. And the third flow was neoconservatism. Neoconservatism is relevant. Why? Because it was a form of revolt against the former progressive era. Think about it, we are at the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 80s. In political terms, we have people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, people that are very, very strong politicians, looking for ideas. Of course, politicians always looking for ideas when they are facing troubles. And this kind of ideas gave them something new to propose. And of course, the adoption by political parties or political leaders such as Thatcher or Reagan give back to these ideas a lot of strength and make this idea hegemonic from many aspects. And neoconservatism was based on the idea that we need law and order. We have to go back to the old traditional values, feminism, babies, against abortion, all this kind of stuff. And there was a reaction that in the middle class that was shaken by the crisis, a long crisis of the 70s, gave them reassurances. Look back, look at the good old world, the good old time, and try to rebuild the good old time. So if you put together these three things, you can understand why it was possible to move from a more progressive conception of the liberal world order that was the conception of the people of the 40s, the people of the Roosevelt staff at the end of the day, to this new version of liberal world order in the 80s and the 90s that was made by people of Reagan or people of Thatcher, more conservative. There is nothing per se good or bad to be progressist or conservative. But the point was that the same label, the same principles, but acted in a very different way in order to what kind of society you want to realize, what kind of idea you have. Why is so relevant all this discussion of what happened a lot of years ago, many decades before you were born? Because the world we are living in is still a world in which the concept, the institutions, the principles, the norms are that of the liberal world order. But the kind of liberal world order that the most of the world outside the Western world faced for the first time was not the progressive, inclusive version sketched by Roosevelt, Churchill, and put down on the Atlantic chart, but was the idea that allowed in the beginning of the 90s, when the Berlin Wall failed, to to include China, to include Russia, to include a lot of countries, just in the name of market. Market and democracy eventually will fall. There was, how can I say, a diversion that was not a plot, was simply the consequence of the ideas that were changing, have been changing during 20 more years. And so putting on the shoulder of the market an enormous charge. And of course, the market failed in that. China entered the WTO, China entered the global economic system and never liberalized. Russia entered the global system and never liberalized. All the Gulf monarchies entered the globalized system. We are living all together in just one capitalist, if you prefer the word, or market global system, but never change. So the point is that it's relevant to understand this switch, because sometimes when we that are living in the Western world think about the liberal world order, we still think to the first. Because our societies have been changed during the 40s, the 50s, the 60s by this social democratic idea, or liberal idea if you prefer, that it was to try to maintain in balance, to balance market and democracy, to make the two cooperate for the good of the people. But the kind of when the others, the rest, not the West, but the rest, think about the liberal world order, is not thinking about that. It's thinking about the structure of the world that we are starting to facing since the 90s. Completely different. Of course, even in the Western world, we are inside this kind of new world in which market is much more stronger than democracies, in which capital has much more rights than labor, and so on. But the point is that our political institutions have been structured on the previous model. So we are living and experiencing a continuous stress between where are we doing, where are we going, and where are we coming from. And where are we coming from was a more inclusive democratic model. Completely different experience for the others that have not this more open, democratic, inclusive model on the back. You can see, and now we jump in the Mediterranean, where all this kind of stuff is relevant for the Med. Because if you look at the Med, you can see almost in a plastic way this difference. The North Shore of the Med is the core of the Western world. The North Shore of the Med, Europe, was a successful result of the liberal world order. Europe with its own European institutions, Europe with their different democratic institutions, Europe with anyway a brilliant and very free political debate with political parties and so on. But if you look at the south, the southern reef of the Med is completely different landscape. And the both are inside this liberal world order. But having in the mind, having in experience, two completely different set of ideas and set of regimes. Of course, not to be naive, it's not just a point of institutions, ideas, and what else. It's even a point of power. And of course, on the northern reef of the Mediterranean, the amount of power that the countries have in the north was often used to regulate troubles with the southern part of the Med. Think about the war in Libya or what else. Now, if it's more clear which is the relationship between this liberal world order and the region in which we live, let me say that if you look at the Mediterranean basin, we can say that this basin represents a crucial region for global economy, and of course, the Med is even a way of communication and influence for cultural, political, and people flows. Through its own water passes a large amount and a big value of the international trade, coming from the Far East, and of the oil arriving from the Gulf region. Through its waters passes, or better, try to pass, tens and tens of thousands of migrants escaping from war, political discrimination, social exclusion, poverty. But it's crucial even in the two competitive visions linking Eastern Asia and Europe, the Silk Road Initiative, with China as a center, and the Cotton Road, with India as a hub. Alternative visions for the new shaping of the relationship between the Western world and the rest of the world. Med is crucial. Even one of the richest trading, technological, and productive economy of the global world is situated on the north shores of the Med. Europe, intended as European Union, and as the most relevant countries inside the continent, is even the region where civil and political liberties, the rule of law, and the divisions of power are more affirmed, stable, and guaranteed. It is the region in the world most characterized by the three main aspects of political modernity at its zenith: liberal democratic institutions, free market, open society. If I try to define what is West today West is not made by religion, by skin colors, by traditions, or all this stuff. Western world today is made by liberal democracies, free market, open society. And you can be Western, being Japanese, Taiwanese, Korean, and you can stop to be Western if you are living in some countries in Central Europe that are getting back in terms of rights, civil rights and liberties. If we go on the southern shores, by contrast, it's almost impossible to individuate effective liberal democracies, with the problematic exception of Israel and the partial exception of Jordan and Turkey, being Turkey more and more far from a genuine democratic pattern. Autocracies such as Egypt and Tunisia, and hybrid regimes such as Morocco and Algeria, even if very diversified one from each other, are much common, and there are even failed states such as Libya, failing states such as Lebanon, rogue states such as Syria. So the two shores of the Mediterranean in terms of quality of institutions are completely different, all inside one common market, one common economic system, but very, very different in terms of political systems. If we look forward to East, including the Middle East and the Arabic-Persian Gulf in our overlook, the situation is even worse. Think about the Islamic Republic of Iran with its policy toward female gender. Think about Yemen facing a long-lasting civil war, the liberal monarchies of the Gulf, and of course the mess between Israel and Palestine. Being Israel facing a deep crisis in its domestic political regime that we are not to forget just because the war is in the last months, and facing an existential threat in the last weeks. Finally, Europe is being under attack in the latest 20 months by the brutal, unjustified, and unprovoked aggression of Putin regime toward Ukraine. The return of interstate war in Europe is something paramount, being the old continent the place on earth where the conditions for a durable and institutionalized peace were the best, able to cross different ages of the international political system, from the Cold War to the rise of globalization. So the return of war in Europe is something enormous, because in Europe was the place in which, through a very large and deep institutional war, Europe was banned. War was banned. The Ukraine war, of course, drastically changed the security landscape and the environment in which Europe lives, forced it to assume much more responsibility for its own security, urges it to transform itself from a net security consumer to a net security provider, able not just to protect its own borders, but even to project security over its borders, so to expand its security bubble. A dramatic but needed change in the EU international posture, self-concept, and self-awareness. Something that pushes us toward, to be clear, a remilitarization of foreign and security policy in Europe. In these latest weeks, the explosion of Gaza war and the risk of its escalation and enlargement is dominating all the other issues and poses a major threat to man's security. How all this began is very well known. On October 7, 2023, a military offensive acted with terroristic tools by Hamas militia targeted, basically, Israeli civilian population near the Gaza Strip, with the intent to kill as much Jewish as possible, to kidnap hundreds of hostages, to shock and awe the people of Israel. As a consequence of this unforgivable act, able to kill around 1,400 of Israelis and take 2,030 hostages, more or less half of the people killed at the Twin Towers in New York City on September 11, 2001, just to give you the scale of what happens. The Israeli government gave start to a massive counteroffensive targeted to destroy the political and military presence of Hamas in the Strip and stopping either the launch of missiles and rockets from Gaza and any possible infiltration of terrorist cells inside Israel. As a result, and in consequence of the adopted tactic by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, massive bombing, and by Hamas, using civilians as human shields, and for the overcrowded conditions of the Strip, around 10,000 of Palestinians have been killed up to now. Most of them civilians, many of them kids and children. This crisis is very risky because it can involve all the Mediterranean basin in this war. So we can try to understand what the different level of analysis that we can use for understanding the crisis. And we can read Gaza war on three different but connected levels. At the local level, it is a new sudden explosion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, enduring since 1947, before the birth of the State of Israel, and knowing ups and downs over all the period. For the skills showed by the Hamas terrorists, it is the first real existential threat that Israel is facing from the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And it is even worse if we just consider the possibility that the scale of the civilians killed in Gaza during the Israeli retaliation and counteroffensive, together with the ignominious, violent action perpetrated mainly by Israeli illegal settlers against unarmed and unoffensive Palestinian farmers in the West Bank, could ignite a general uprisal of the same West Bank. I just want to underline that it is the first time ever that a Middle Eastern war is exploding, having a major war in Europe. We have never faced this kind of double condition. Even during the worst period of the Cold War, the war in the Middle East were acting while in Europe peace was preserved. So this is a fact that changed completely the scale of danger and risk. Now, the possible uprisal of the West Bank could be extremely dangerous in two different and combined directions. The transformation of the war from a conflict between a state and a political terroristic organization into a full intercommunitarian war. Something never seen since 1947, before the borders of the Israeli state. And the second factor, the involvement of Hezbollah in the war. from the northern border of Israel and Lebanon. As a matter of fact, this evolution could be able to create the worst possible scenario for Israel, forced to defend itself on a three-front conflict. The context in which Hamas launched its terror offensive is dominated by the failure of the Benjamin Netanyahu security policy. This security policy was based on two wrong commitments, on two wrong ideas, wrong in terms of non-realistic. On the one hand, there was the great and dangerous illusion for Israel to take root inside the Middle East region by completing the peace treaties undersigned with Egypt and Jordan with the new architecture of the so-called Abraham agreements. The agreements aimed to work mainly on the economic level, to favorite the social and political integration of Israeli and the Gulf monarchies. But firstly, they underestimate the limits of any integration pursued just through economic convenience. This was the lesson of all these years. Economic convenience is not enough to produce convergence, especially in a region still crossed by unsolved political and religious tensions. Secondly, they don't really provide any step forward on the so-called peace process in Palestine. So they give the impression to bet on the hypothesis of buying for peanuts, the perspective of any independence for a Palestinian state. On the other hand, a different but complementary illusion was working. The illusion to isolate Israel from the turbulent neighbors, pursued through walls, the fence in West Bank, the wall, and the electrified barrier around Gaza, assailing the Iron Dome system, capable to intercept of any kind of rocket, torpedoing any moderate interlocutor, and letting radical political subjects to grow in order to disqualify any realistic opportunity of sincere dialogue. So if you look at the situation, I'm not putting Israeli and Hamas on the same level, the same plan. I'm just saying that the project of security policy of the Netanyahu government was completely based on wrong premises and produced a situation in which what Hamas is doing, that is not the result of that, but is the result of the political aim of Hamas, that is a religious and political and terroristic movement that have the goal to destroy Israel, produce a great result in terms of getting support from the people of Palestine. That's the point. It's not the point to justify or not justify the political nature of Hamas. The point is that if they have their own agenda is unswallowable for you, but you do whatever you can for putting consensus under their own agenda, that's the contest. That's the contest. This project was kept compatible with the acceptance of the fait accompli of the monstrous growing of illegitimate Israeli settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. About 500 settlers in West Bank and 250 settlers in East Jerusalem. So I want just to make clear that the political weight of illegitimate settlers on the Israeli political life is close to that played by the Pieds Noirs, the French settlers in Algeria, during the 50s. Of course, even we were not born in the 50s. But if you go back to the history of the French Republic, in the 50s, there were the Pieds Noirs, the settlers in Algeria, French settlers. And they were able not just to hijack the colonial policy of France, I mean, to be able to intercept and to modify and to make pressure over the colonial war that France was conducting against the Algerians in the 50s. in the 50s, but was able to hijack the general political life in France. The Fourth Republic was a step to collapse. I mean, the Fourth Republic collapsed, but the French democracy was a step to collapse for the effect of the pied noir pressure over democratic life in France, not in Algeria. And this is exactly what is happening, in my opinion, in Israel in these last 20 years. It confirms, if needed, that colonial occupation and decolonization wars jeopardize the quality of democracy of the colonial rulers, not just make the life of the ruled impossible, but waste the quality of democracies. And if you look at France in the 50s, the Indochina, before the end of the 40s, Indochina War and then Algeria War, and you look at what happens to the democratic life in France, you can see a strict connection. And the feeling, my opinion is that what is happening in Israel and what has been happening in Israel in the last 20 years is just following the same pattern. The Israeli security strategy based on the Abraham Agreement and the risk of enlargement of the Gaza war to Lebanon through Hezbollah is what lifts us to the superior level of analysis, from the local level to the regional level. And if you go at the regional level, the players are not just, of course, Israel, the Palestinians, Hamas, Hezbollah, but we have to add at least Iran, Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its allies, and Yemen. The challenge between the Saudis and the Iranians is far to be passed. The Abraham's Agreement, in fact, lean upon and reinforce the US leadership on the region, and that is simply not acceptable for the Tehran regime. This is another weak point of the Abraham's Agreement. Do an agreement taking player out of the agreement. Especially in this season of growing domestic difficulties for the Ayatollahs, we must not make the error to over-evaluate the scope of the Chinese influence on the process of rapprochement between the kingdom and the Islamic Republic. And it should be naive to consider that China could have an interest in restoring American hegemony on the Gulf. But at the regional level, even the security interests of Egypt and Jordan are involved by this crisis, from this crisis. And both the regimes have no interest, a will to cooperate in any direct or indirect process of expulsion of the Palestinians out from their land. No Arab state could take into consideration to be an actor or even a facilitator of the new Nakba project applied to Gaza. So all the idea that we can move the Gaza people outside from Gaza and push to Egypt is completely crazy. Crazy, completely. Last but not least, there is Ankara, with President Erdogan emphasizing the Islamic nature of its former democratic regime for ideological reasons and for tactical ones, domestically to distract its own electoral constituency from the economic difficulties of Turkey, internationally for trying to play a major regional role, from Syria to Azerbaijan, from Libya to Sudan. In the last decade, Turkey and Iran have been, and still are, the two vertices of a triangle having Russia as the third main apex. And this strategic triangle leads us from the regional dimension to the international dimension. Iran is playing not just its own strategy in the Middle East in a regional way, a strategy in which Hamas, Houthi, and Hezbollah are union partners, but Iran is even a part of the Russian strategy. Why the Russian strategy in the region? A union partner itself of the Russian strategy played at a superior level. Just to give an idea, the only way to come out from this crisis in Gaza, in my opinion, of course, and to make now, not later, now, a public impegnative announcement that the end of the war and the destruction, eventually destruction, mental destruction of Hamas could get immediately to the board of a real independent and sovereign Palestinian state. And the announcement should have to be done now, not later. It's an announcement and a promise that you don't do to Hamas. It's a promise that you do to Palestinian people. It's the only way to separate Hamas from Palestinians, to show to Palestinians that there is an alternative way than supporting Hamas to get full independence. But of course, the problem is not just the promise. The problem is even who is the person that make this promise. Because in international politics, reputation matters. And Netanyahu has no reputation enough to make this promise. It's simply unbelievable, this kind of promise, if coming out from the mouth of Netanyahu. So the first step is that Netanyahu has to resign. And then a different Israeli government had to do this promise and then complete in a much more human way the operation against Hamas. All this structure, of course, is very unlikely under these political circumstances. But the point is that when we think about what can we do, we are starting in a box made by what is likely or unlikely. We can produce nothing new. The problem is to have a wide picture of the situation, to be able to make proposals. Then the political decision maker will pick up the kind of proposal that is able to bring on its shoulder. That's the point. I go to the conclusion. Iran, in this relationship between Iran and Russia, Iran provides drones, rockets, and even sophisticated technology to Russia for its war in Europe against Ukraine. So this is another kind of link between the regional and the international. And I desire just quickly underline how serious is the fact that Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is tightening its relationship with two regimes, Iran and North Korea, still under UN sanctions for openly violating the former and being suspected to violate the latter, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the last treaty, is the most relevant treaty, is the global treaty by definition, because nuke always has a global relevance, is not a regional matter, nuclear. And Russia is not just doing war in Ukraine without any kind of decent reason, but it's making a strong relationship with North Korea and Iran, two countries that are under sanctions for violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So Turkey, by its side, is more and more a swing state, indicted of cooperating with Russia to elude the Western sanctions toward it after the aggression of Ukraine, much more aligned to autocracies than to democracies in a growing number of issues, basically define the liberal and Western nature of the international order. For Russia and for any other state interested in challenging the liberal nature of the international order and the American leadership, Middle East is the ideal theater for adding new wood on the fire. And for trying to split the Western countries, Americans and Europeans have different ideas of what is acceptable or not in the Middle East. Europe itself, because Italians or Spaniards or, how can I say, French, have different ideas of what is acceptable in the Middle East if compared to Britons or Dutch or Germans. And even European governments and their public opinions, as we can see in all the rallies that are going on all over the continent. For the so-called double standard that Western countries have been adopting towards Israel's policies and still adopt, Europe is easily under attack from any actor that would blame the European democracies of hypocrisy. And that's a crucial point for us. We are not to be sticky to our principles just because it's right. It's the right thing to do. But even because in this theater and on Israel, we have been always under the lens of people from outside that say, okay, but we have a double standard. You say something for Ukrainians and not for Palestinians. You say the Russians are occupying Ukraine, true, but you don't say that the Israelis are occupying the West Bank in the last 60 years, true. So this is something that if we want to be believed, if we want to restore, to refresh the principles of the liberal world order, that were anyway the most open, the most liberal principles ever seen in the history of world orders, we have to take coherence seriously. Not just the coherence of the others, our coherence. For the good reason that we are on the top of the world. We are still on the top of the world. So we have a particular duty to give example and to show that we are able to act morally and not just in terms of opportunities. This narrative of the hypocrisy of democracy is particularly useful to Russia in the effort to demonstrate that the Western opposition, especially the European one, and the military support to Ukraine is not a due answer to a gross violation of founding principles of international legality, but just a geopolitical move feeded by anti-Russian sentiment. We know that this is the reason why we are supporting Ukraine, but we have to make not just the right thing, but to make the right thing understandable, comprehensible. It is right and it has to appear right. And of course, for Russia, the war in Gaza consents to going on its aggression war in Europe, being public opinions, governments, and support diverted from Ukraine war to Gaza war. And we have to say as Europeans that if Israel faces an existential threat in the Middle East, Europe is facing an existential threat in Ukraine. For our continent, the war in Ukraine is much more dangerous than the war in Gaza, because Ukraine is in Europe, because the regional dimension of this crisis is here. And so the war in Ukraine is not just an international crisis for us. It's an international crisis, of course, because it involves Russia, involves the European Union, involves United States, China, I mean, great players, big players on the international arena. But it is even a crisis that is on our border, on our own border. So we can understand all the worries of the others, but we need that the others understand our worries. And I don't want to push up a political argument, but Israel is asking for a lot of solidarity, and it will receive solidarity because it's right to face the threat of Hamas. But Israel was giving practically zero solidarity to Ukraine against Russia. Netanyahu government was going on make an agreement with Russia and giving nothing to Ukraine. And Ukraine was, by the way, was a country in which the president is a Jew. Tell me one other place in Europe where the president is a Jew. When we look at the Ukrainian democracy and say, but it's democracy so-and-so, not so perfect, imagine a Spanish prime minister, a Jewish Spanish prime minister, a Jewish Italian prime minister, huh? A French Jewish president. So when we look at the others with the suponencias, think about ourselves. Think about how we are different from what we tell about us and how we act. The dimension of Russian threat to Europe was even directly affecting the Mediterranean waters, of course. Military units of the Russian fleet are cruising in the central and eastern Mediterranean. Moscow is trying to establish a naval and air force base in Cyrenaica. Putin's influence in sub-Saharan Africa is growing up. Passing to sub-Saharan Africa, we entered in the challenge to trying to manage in a human and effective way the phenomenon of migration. It is one of the hottest dossiers inside European Union, and the Mediterranean is the central point of this dossier, source of disagreement and tensions between its member states. We should start from the practical and ethical, and the two things are together, impossibility to simply stop the flows. So forget about it to stop the flows. Forget it. It's not possible, and it is not right. That said, and affirm, it remains the political difficulty to arbitrate between different per se legitimate expectations. On the one hand, the expectations of the resident citizens not to see a radical and quick change of their social landscape and environment, to maintain the core of its taxes devoted primarily to the taxpayers, and to be able to modify their government's policies according to their party choice through the elections of their representatives, is a theme of responsiveness inside democracies. We cannot skip this point. If people don't like to have too many migrants, we have to understand how can we have human and correct policies dealing with this preference of people. Because for any policy we need support. It's not just something that you can say nothing. You have to do something. For doing something, you need political support. So you have to look at the vehicles, look at the constriction. On the other hand, there are the expectations of migrants to try the implementations of their own human rights wherever it could be possible their protection. And this kind of expectations has the same weight or the other kind of expectations, of course. We are not to forget that, because human rights are human rights, simply. And it's not a matter of discussion. In its own speech for thanking the Nobel Prize Commission for giving him the Peace Nobel Prize in 1953, General George Marshall, the Marshall of the Marshall Plan, the Marshall of the Second World War, and so on, made a speech that was 22 minutes speech, 22 minutes, in which he said that in 1953, we had to face the novelty of people that were not entitled to have human rights, political rights, civil rights, that are discovering that these kind of rights are not just rights for Europeans and Americans, are rights for every human. And this will be one of the biggest novelty of the century. George Marshall, 1953, a general. So imagine what kind of thinking about some politicians that will listen here, imagine like as in Italy, as in France, as in Germany, and what else, and think how this general, that for sure was not a politician, for sure was not so well educated, could understand in these 70 years ago, 80 years ago. And it's not an easy task, of course, to arbitrate between different interests, but it's just a duty of politics. Politics exists and is legitimate for that, for arbitration of interest, and politics consists of that, to arbitrate between space and time, interests and expectations of different subjects, maintaining the sticky adhesion to the constitutional principles of a political community. War put further pressure on this, and move Europe look for effective and assertive leadership, able to imagine, elaborate, and communicate clear visions of the future, to produce cohesion and to collect support, to be bearer of values. We cannot give up our values, because our values made us in the same way that our interests made us. But which values? The picture I tried to sketch tells us that democracies are under attack. The attack proceeds from a double direction. The first is from inside. It is fed by poor responsiveness of the democratic system, worsening of the quality of democracy, unfairness and inequality, decline of the trust in the effectiveness and moral superiority of democracy. All these factors feed populistic and identitarian drifting, visible either on the right and on the left side of the political spectrum. And this is a new kind of novelty. Populism or identitarian politics is not just a far-right stuff. It's stuff that on the right and on the left we can find. The second direction of this attack is from outside, and the external attacks are coming from international arena, such as the growing of influence and numbers of autocracies and their progressive alignment. We cannot say that there is an alliance between China and Russia or Iran and Russia and so on, but there is an alignment, a progressive alignment, a progressive common point of view over a lot of dossiers. The return of religious radicalism, the presence of two wars inside and at the borders of Europe, and the relative decline of the US leadership. I think I use the expression relative decline because I was born in 1961, and since I was a child, not a boy, there were people talking about the US decline. And I want to be able to decline in my old age, like the Americans were declining in the last 80 years. Because okay, if this is decline, I sign for this kind of decline, okay. But of course, everything is destined to die, and so even the American leadership is declining. The point is how speed this decline will be happening. And of course, we are not to underestimate that differently from human life that are more or less lasting 80 years if you are very lucky, 100 for the girls. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They were lucky. and for hegemonic leadership, the period could be 100 years, 30 years, 3 centuries. Think about Napoleonic hegemony in Europe, so small, and think about the Roman hegemony in the world, or Chinese hegemony in Far East, and so on. They need to make Europe a stronghold of the liberal and democratic values and of the principles of the liberal world order is something that we have to be in our mind, a stronghold. This is more and more crucial in an age that it will be marked by possible growing divergence between democracies and autocracies, after a long age of convergence between democracies and autocracies. All the so-called global era, the last 30 years, we were facing convergence of democratic system and non-democratic system. What we are facing now is divergence of these two kinds of regimes. And it will not change very quickly. At the very end, it's the end of the illusion that the simple diffusion of the market, the creation of a unique globalized economy, bring peace automatically. It's not true. And we know that to be able to manage the millennium challenges, such as global warming, just to quote one, we need to try the way to cooperate between democracies and autocracies. We need to find a way to develop a new kind of multilateralism, but in a very difficult situation, just when the liberal principles that up to now have inspired rules, norms, and institutions are contested. Until 2007, 2008, neither Russia nor China contested the principle of the liberal world order. Now they contest the principles. They propose different principles. But even if the situation is much more difficult than before, we are living this era, and so we have to take the duty and to try to solve. International institutions at the very end must be defended, even with good practices and good policies. This is the reason why we cannot go on with double standard. Affirming values in action, because when the storm will be over, they will facilitate to reestablish a positive dialogue. Of course, international institutions can be criticized for their limited effectiveness, but we should remember that their spread has been the real positive novelty of the last century, able to make the world a little less brave than before, able to make the world safer for democracies. The defense of democratic practices and values today needs a safe area in which they are implemented and protected. What is up to us is the choice about what kind of castle we have in mind. Because even if we need that stranglehold castle to defend and protect liberal values, gender equality, all this kind of stuff that we believe in, the point is that we can have in mind different castles. We can be inspired by Camelot, you know, Camelot Castle, Arthur Knights, that was not just a stronghold of values and principles, but even a lighthouse in the dark, able to spread its principles and value outside and to be a safe harbor for people in search of protection. A safe harbor for people in search of protection. This is, Camelot was a castle, but what this kind of castle? Or we can imagine Europe as the Winterfell, or beyond the wall, the castles of the Game of Thrones, remember? Sealed, close to any foreigner, a dark place in which life conditions were not so different from those of the strangers living outside. This is the true challenge that all of us have to face and to win if we want to still have the opportunity to preserve democracy. We can define democracy in many ways. The definition I prefer is very simple. Democracy is the gentlest way to govern people that has been ever invented in the 2050 years. The most gentle way to govern people. The most gentle way to use power. This is the reason why we should love it and defend it at any cost. And thank you for your attention.
Well, dear Professor, thank you very much for your very synthetic and worldwide scope of the world, and we have been so deep in many questions and many different affairs, trying to seek the economic point of view, the social, the political. I was really moved for what you said about Prime Minister, because one of the weakest point of the Victorian era in the UK, you know, the one between the war of Crimea, once more Ukraine, and the First World War was Israeli, Benjamin Disraeli, who was a Jew.
Right.
Yeah. He was the only one that had a Jewish prime minister. By the whole, he was Disraeli of Spanish origin. He was a Sephardic.
But I'm not so sure that Israeli was still Jewish in terms of religion when he was prime minister.
Culturally, yes, I would say, yeah. Not in practice, but it was. But, you know, it was a good thing, anyway, to have the... And I was wondering, I'm sure you have you have plenty of questions. I would like to, you know, to say, I fully agree that, you know,
If you prefer, si lo prefieren, pueden hacer las preguntas en español, que para mí es bastante fácil de comprenderlo, bastante. Yo puedo intentar de contestar a ustedes en español, si la cosa es clara. Si prefieres, poder hacer en inglés y vamos a ver lo que pasa, ¿ok?
Bueno, yo antes de pasar la voz al público y sobre todo al embajador que siempre nos hace la primera pregunta, yo tengo un par de preguntas, pero yo creo que, bueno, en fin.
Anda.
Mi pregunta primera es si es posible pensar en términos de democracia una especie de democracia inculturada para ciertos países. Es decir, hemos tenido varios tipos de democracia a lo largo de la historia, la griega, más aristocrática, liberal, actual. Pero me pregunto si es posible en algunos países que todavía que funcionan donde las comunidades son muy importantes a nivel muy vinculadas a un tipo de democracia como inculturada, ¿no? No olvidemos que el primer, llevamos el año 47, llevamos mucho tiempo, diría que llevamos 20 siglos con la cuestión Palestina-Israel, pero sí que es verdad que el auge del yihadismo empieza en el año 78 con la quema de Cine Rex de Teherán, cuando se están exponiendo películas de valores occidentales, ¿no? Entonces me pregunto si tal vez no nos sucede como cuando los primeros misioneros católicos se fueron a China, que llevaron una carga cultural europea, si nosotros no hemos sido, o si es posible desarrollar una especie de concepto inculturado de democracia de acuerdo con aquellas culturas, ¿no? Donde la comunidad es más importante, la umma es más importante que el individuo, que en términos evidentemente occidentales y liberales siempre es la persona el centro de la cuestión, ¿no? La segunda, sí, y es muy breve, en relación a una de las reuniones que tuve en el Parlamento Europeo hace 3 semanas, si cree que realmente hemos dejado Europa, hemos dejado África, que está en manos de Wagner, que está en manos de todos los de China, y no deberíamos haber hecho un plan Marshall a 50 años para fortalecer las instituciones democráticas y realmente contar fully con ellas, ¿no? Realmente un plan Marshall amplio a 50 años vista, muy potente y con una gran inversión. Tenemos la política de vecindad, que es muy importante, pero tal vez sí pudiese darse algún paso más, ¿no? Poco más, he tomado un montón de apuntes, lo cual he aprendido un montón. Muchísimas gracias, porque uno siempre, aunque por mucho que lea, siempre escuchar a quien realmente sabe de esas cosas siempre es muy interesante. Y desde luego coincido plenamente en que la salida es siempre la creación de un Estado palestino. Ahora es difícil plantear esas cuestiones, pero es verdad que parece la única salida, pero en cualquier caso un Estado democrático, ¿no? Porque es verdad que Israel es la única democracia, por decir así, surrounded por un montón de países, como Jordania, Libia, no Libia, perdón, Líbano, Jordania, Líbano, bueno, Irán queda un poco lejos pero amenaza, Turquía queda un poco lejos pero amenaza también, Egipto está por abajo, entonces digamos que es la única democracia en términos liberales del contexto, ¿no? Entonces no sé si tal vez el desarrollo del Estado palestino debería estar vinculado a la asunción de un modelo democrático. Bien, son un poco mis preguntas y observaciones. Le agradezco muchísimo porque he aprendido realmente mucho y gracias por también la concisión.
Gracias. Ahora puede ver si soy capaz de hablar en español, hablando, ¿no?, de cosas de español, de la calle, más español, más cultural, decimos. Y la primera pregunta, por supuesto, nosotros no podemos olvidar que la gran mayoría de las democracias consolidadas en el mundo son democracias occidentales. Esto tiene un doble significado. Por un lado son democracias que tienen un rostro cultural más o menos cercano, la diferencia no es demasiada. Y por otro lado son democracias que han sido y todavía son los países más ricos del mundo, que han sido en el pasado más o menos imperialistas o colonizadores, sin querer poner algo negativo en el tiempo de Colón o qué sé, pero esta es una verdad, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que tenemos una serie de desafíos, lo sapeo, de desafíos concéntricos. El primero es intentar de tener una posición común en las democracias del norte y del sur del mundo, porque lo van a ver en estas crisis palestinas o de Gaza, que hay y además en la guerra en Ucrania, que las democracias del sur del mundo no están alineadas con las democracias del norte. Brasil o India tienen posiciones muy más, ¿cómo puedo decir?, muy menos firme que los de los europeos o los de los democracias del norte del mundo. Entonces, esto nos dice que tenemos un problema de individuar posiciones, rumbas o trayectorias que pueden llegar a un acercamiento de las democracias del sur y del norte. Y ya sería un enorme resultado. Por supuesto, tenemos que concebir que la posición mediana no puede ser la nuestra. También si tenemos la urgencia de clarificar que nosotros no podemos quitar los principios democráticos de nuestra constitución o de nuestro estilo de vida. Ahora, si voy a pensar en el Mediterráneo, el problema más típico en la difusión de la democracia al sur es la relación con la religión. Vamos a entendernos, aquí estaba la Sacra Inquisición, ¿no? A Toledo ponían los judíos en los hornos hasta que Napoleón llegó aquí. Entonces, la historia de Europa es hecha de radicalismo religioso, de guerras sanguinarias. Y nosotros sabemos que nuestro camino para llegar a la democracia ha sido pasar por el Estado que quita la religión del discurso político, no es más relevante, no es más legítimo, con modos brutos tal vez, esto pasó. Y luego de poner la religión fuera de la esfera pública. Esto ha sido nuestro track, nuestro camino. Por un lado sabemos que no está verdaderamente así hacia el fondo, porque también en Europa, en Estados Unidos, más y más, tenemos este discurso religioso político que es más volvente, que vuelve atrás, es más relevante. Y por otro lado sabemos que todo no es así perfecto. Pero cuando vamos a ver lo que pasa, ¿qué puedo decir? En Tunisia, que fue el país donde ya empezaron las primaveras.
Sí, primaveras árabes.
Primaveras árabes. También allá, al final, el resultado fue un desastre. No fue un consolidamiento democrático, pero ha sido algo diferente. Y la pregunta que yo tengo, a quien no sé responder ¿es posible una democracia con un engombro de la religión así enorme? Yo no lo sé. Lo que sé es que si vamos a tomar las personas más penalizadas de estas cosas, que son mujeres, nunca encontré mujeres en Afganistán o en el Medio Oriente, en el Oriente Medio, que decían, no, nos gusta de estar veladas, nos gusta de no haber el derecho de estudiar. Me acuerdo que en los primeros años de las operaciones de la invasión del Afganistán, tenía la ocasión de hacer una conferencia en una universidad en Kabul. Y estuve por otras cosas, pero al final siempre era un profesor. Y lo que me impresionó más fue en esta aula como esta, llena de estudiantes, las chicas. Las chicas eran más que la mitad de los estudiantes y tenían caras, ojos de estar viviendo un sueño y ahora viven una pesadilla. Entonces, toda la mía tolerancia o comprensión para las diferencias culturales se para al derecho de cada individuo de poder elegir su estilo de vida. Este no es una cosa en la que se puede contrastar. La democracia no puede ser alguien que impide a unos singlos, también uno solo, de hacer de seguir lo que cree. Si no, no es democracia. Entonces, yo entiendo que la liberal democracia es alguien que nosotros hemos hecho un modelo de una experiencia histórica, verdaderamente. Pero hemos tenido éxitos tal veces, porque si usted, dos cosas, si piensas a lo que los ingleses o los alemanes o los franceses pensaban de los españoles o de los italianos, ellos no pueden haber democracia, porque democracia no es por italianos, españoles, portugueses, gente demasiado cachonda, no sé si se puede decir cachonda.
Sí.
Y al final todos los sistemas democráticos vivimos en instituciones democráticas. Se puede decir que Italia no funciona magníficamente, pero si uno mira a Inglaterra hay mucho más problemas o otras cosas. Entonces, en un 100 años, lo que parecía imposible ha pasado. Cuando en los 70s, por la primera vez llegué aquí, estaba todavía el franquismo. Y me decían los españoles, los funcionarios, yo era un chico muy curioso de política, y me decían siempre: España es diferente. ¿Por qué no tenéis democracia aquí? España es diferente. Que era siempre la sola misma contestación de cuando uno quiere hacer lo que quiere, ¿no? Sí, democracia es fantástica, para vosotros democracia marcha, ma España es diferente. Entonces, cuando uno habla con los tíos que tienen el poder, te dicen Marruecos es diferente, Algeria es diferente, ¿no? Tunisia es diferente, Líbano es diferente. Pero yo creo que si uno va a preguntar a las mujeres de estos lugares, les pregunta: ¿esta diferencia? Te le van a explicar la diferencia. La diferencia es el disfrutamiento, disfrute de mirar de la población. Entonces, es muy complicado pensar cuál es el límite cultural de la democracia. Pero yo creo que yo nunca encontré una persona que quiere ser esclavo en mi vida. Nunca encontré. Tal vez no frecuento club de escambistas sexual, no sé, pero nunca encontré un tío o una tía que me dice: me gusta ser esclavo, servir. Nunca. Yo creo que este es independiente de las culturas. Es lo que tenemos como seres humanos. Yo creo esto. Y por África es muy importante, mas tal vez creo que es demasiado tarde por unos aspectos. En el sentido que, claro, tenemos que hacer mucho más, pero lo llevamos diciendo hace decenas de años, no hemos hecho prácticamente nada y hemos consentido a los chinos de llegar en África. No es el problema que son chinos los chinos, pero el problema es que cuando los europeos estaban pensando en los 80, ¿dónde podemos ir a expandir nuestras economías? Y así tenían África. África es del otro lado del mar. África, ¿sabes? Naturalmente hay un problema. Los africanos, cuando piensan en los europeos, no piensan como nosotros creemos, porque por muchos años nosotros hemos sido malos dueños de los africanos. Y cuando te vas en África, naturalmente los africanos dicen: yo soy francés. Pero, o inglés, no va a pensar a liberté, égalité, fraternité. Va a pensar al gobierno colonial del África occidental francesa, o a la guerra de Algeria, también por los ingleses, también por los italianos. Vosotros han sido afortunados que ya tenían el Sahara español al final. Entonces, los saharaui tal vez, ¿no? En tiempos recientes. Aquí habéis tenido un enorme imperio colonial, pero en África no así mucho. Pero por los africanos, los europeos, no son, ¿cómo puedo decir?, los salvadores. Hay también una dificultad cultural. Es la misma cosa cuando fui en Líbano, así en el Líbano muchas veces por servicio, pero siempre me hacía reír que los franceses pensaban que los libaneses lo querían. Porque aquí nosotros hemos tenido hemos inventado el Líbano en los 40s. A los libaneses no les gustaban los franceses por el hecho de que eran los gobernadores coloniales. Y tal vez los italianos lo mismo con los líbicos, que decían: ¿por qué los líbicos no nos aman? Fíjate. Entonces hay problemas, pero no hay alternativas que intentar. El desarrollo de África es un win-win opportunity, porque si se desarrolla, vamos a ganar todos. Si no se desarrolla, vamos a perder, estamos ya perdiendo. Entonces, no hay mucho, muy nada de perder en muchos aspectos. Hay que poner resources, este es el problema, de encontrar resources y de poner resources.
Muy bien, yo creo que...
Hablo demasiado, perdona.
No, es estupendo. Yo creo que antes de pasar la voz a un par de preguntas, porque el tiempo se nos echa encima, yo creo que el embajador Florenza sí tiene... en fin, sí. Bueno, pues ahora... Bueno, gracias. Pues alguna pregunta. Siempre hay un riesgo de los que se sientan en la primera fila, y es que cuando no hay voluntarios uno acaba preguntando en clase a los que se sientan en la primera fila. Pero, ¿alguna pregunta sobre todas las cuestiones globales, locales, culturales, políticas expresadas esta tarde? ¿Sí?
Yo tengo una pregunta. En referencia, hablábamos de que la democracia... Vale, gracias. Vale. Hola. Hola, vale. Hablábamos de que la democracia a veces como que la asociamos a una construcción mental de Occidente. Mi pregunta es, claro, aquellos países en los que la norma del Estado es la religión, muchos de esos países han sido colonias de los países europeos. Y claro, me viene a la mente pensar que si, como tú decías, hemos hecho todo este camino de haber sufrido, entre comillas, haber pasado muchas cosas para conseguir separar la religión del Estado, ¿por qué cuando estábamos, o sea, en esos países, había esas colonias, no se consiguió transmitir, o sea, que ellos no tuvieran que hacer ese camino, sino que ya estábamos implementando, realmente eran parte de esos estados? Entonces, ¿por qué no se consiguió mantener esos valores allí? No sé si es una cuestión de que pasamos de un intervencionismo del 100% a abandonarles completamente, y seguramente eso pues provocó que a falta de institución, a falta de tal, pues tengamos las democracias que seguramente hay ahora en esos países, que es fallidas, si simplemente son títeres puestos. Y claro, eso me da a pensar que no sé si es porque realmente los abandonamos o porque realmente no hubo de fondo una intención de transmitir esos valores para que ellos consiguieran desarrollar esas democracias.
Gracias por la pregunta. En la pregunta usted ya ha puesto la respuesta, porque en la parte final este es el hecho. Los que estudian los estudios postcoloniales nos dicen que hay, grosolamente, dos modelos de relaciones entre la metrópoli y la colonia. El modelo francés, que era de incluir, de crear una suerte de comunidad, un tipo de comunidad. Y el modelo inglés, que era más, ¿quién es en comando aquí? Tú, entonces yo hablo contigo y tú sigues haciendo lo que quieres, pero responde a mí mismo. Al final, el modelo inglés era más adherente a la realidad de la relación entre el país colonizador y la colonia, porque no le interesaba nada otro que extraer resources, cosas, minos, hombres, lo que pasaba. El modelo francés fue, ¿cómo puedo decirle? El resultado fue que fue más hipócrita. Pero el sentido tal vez fue simplemente de no entender que no puede haber libertad, égalité, fraternité en Francia por los franceses y algo menos por los otros. Entonces también el modelo francés, que es un modelo que políticamente es muy neto en la separación del Estado y de la religión en Francia. Como sabes, por ejemplo, la Iglesia Cattolica en Francia no tiene un estatuto oficial como tiene, por ejemplo, en Italia, en España, ¿no? En Francia es diferente en este sentido. No hay ninguna relación oficial entre el Estado y la religión, tampoco la religión católica, que es no así monopolista como en España o en Italia, porque hay muchos reformados, pero bastante importante. Fue una consecuencia de la Revolución Francesa, que quitó poder y riqueza.
Sí, riqueza.
A los curas. pero nunca los poderes coloniales han tenido una intención de desarrollar los colonizados. Tampoco en nivel de instrucción. El paradoxo ha sido que todos los grandes revolucionarios de Indochina, Ho Chi Minh, o de África, Senghor, estudiaron en Francia y fueron nutridos de las ideales de la República y luego tocaron con mano que los ideales de la República eran veros solo por los blancos, al final. Y esta es la razón por qué no hemos construido proprio nada. Y el concepto del gobierno colonial es divide et impera. Pones unos contra los otros, ¿no? El clásico ejemplo es Hutu y Tutsi en Ruanda, Burundi, en Uganda, ¿no? Es mezclar poblaciones para controlarlas al mejor. Entonces, esto ha sido. ¿Podemos hacer algo diferente? Sí, pero la política europea de Ring of Friends, si usted se acuerda, ¿no? La Neighbor Policy, la política de vecinado, era basada en la idea de construir un anhelo de amigos con los países que no pueden entrar en la Unión, pero que pueden estar cerca de la Unión. Y el proceso de Barcelona ha sido un trozo importante en esta idea, pero ha sido un fiasco total. Un fiasco. Un fiasco total. No hay un país democrático en el sur del Mediterráneo. El único país que ha creído en el Ring of Friends, la Ucrania, ahora está en guerra invadida por la Rusia. Entonces, tenemos que hacer un examen sobre la efectividad de nuestras políticas al exterior. Y tenemos que hacerlo muy rápido porque la situación el tiempo no es nuestro aliado. Lo puede devenir si nosotros tenemos una idea del tiempo. Tenemos que tener una idea del futuro, cómo queremos diseñar este mundo que llega. Si tenemos esta idea, el tiempo es nuestro aliado. Si vamos navegando a la vista, el tiempo es nuestro enemigo. Esto es la razón por la que cuando hablamos o estudiamos intentamos de hacer, tal vez de decir anche cosas que parecen irrealísticas ahora, porque el mundo de hoy está hecho de cosas que ayer eran irrealísticas, pero que alguien decía se puede hacer y al final se hicieron, el mundo cambió. Siempre es lo mismo, no vamos a inventar nada de nuevo. No sé si le contesté.
Muy bien. ¿Hay alguna pregunta más? Hay tiempo tal vez para una más, no muchas más. Sí.
Thank you. Actually, I'm not used to speak on microphones so well, and second, I'm pretty boiled up, but I will try to be short and quick. As you mentioned, special liberal democracy, it's really dependent on historical context. It shouldn't be taken for granted that democracy could and should be spread everywhere. And thinking about my studies, actually, I see kind of a trend to rethink IR theory in a sense, and also liberal democracy, the Western world. How does it shape really the intersection between countries and states? So far from what I know, better to say, as we know, China is becoming prominent, for instance, a major player. And thus, after Xi Jinping, they are trying to reassert Chinese values in that sense. Thus to shape IR as a subject. My question is on one hand, some scholars, Western scholars, are trying to say that we should better understand other values, thus to reformulate this liberal order, still maintaining the principles but adapting to new perspectives. Others, on the other hand, they try to set a dichotomy, so us and them. Personally, I do think this is really interesting and should be like discussed with deeper insight. And this is kind of my question. What's your view on this point?
It's a good question. And all the questions that you made have been very, very interesting and deep. There is true in the both perspective, I presume. It's true that we should try to keep away all the excess of Western accent in democracy. We have to, if we want to make other people to jump in democracy, we have to make democracy not a white man club with white man accent and so on, no? And for instance, the major attention that we put on the gender questions is something that is useful for the gender questions, of course, but even because push us to the effort of reconsidering the words of democracy. So when you work hardly in a sector, then the kind of work that you are doing that can suggest you something to use in another field and get you trained to make brain gym to try to do that. And at the same time, we have to take seriously that in terms of leadership, not all the leaders can be interested in democracy diffusion. You were talking about China. I think that Xi Jinping has no interest in changing the form of government of China, and more or less all the people of the Communist Party in the People's Republic of China is more worried about the perspective to lose power than the perspective to spread democracy. What went wrong? Probably we misunderstood this point. I think that even Deng Xiaoping was never thinking about democracy. Deng Xiaoping was thinking about reduction of poverty. He was used to say that, of course, we don't want to give up socialism, but we don't want to go on in being poor under socialism. And we intend this point as, okay, it is moving to our principles. In these terms, the point of the over-evaluating of the market force to pull to liberalization, democratization, that was the Clinton doctrine toward China, to engage China, and China will become a market, a free market state, and then will become a liberal democracy. It was a failure. It was not a failure of Clinton. It was a failure of the bulk of ideas that were working on this direction. Because in that case, the neoliberal ideas were very useful for trying to understand how to put the market again in movement, but were bad lens for looking at some problems. So if we move today and we look at China, we have to understand what kind of lens we have to put on our eyes to be able to understand the real signals, if there are, inside China. In this moment, China is openly contesting the principles of the liberal world order, especially the liberal principles of the world order. They are not contesting the market principle or what else. but they are contesting that democracy and liberty. And maybe we have to work for lateral patterns. If we will be able to launch this idea of the Cotton Road, could be something that can push China in thinking what to do. Because if I were Chinese in terms of if I were Xi, I have to notice that when we talk about reglobalization or friendshoring or nearshoring, that are things that are crucial for us to be able to not be so weak in the future like we were toward Russia in these years. At the end of the line, the bottom line of this is less China in our economy. Less China. Not China at all, but for sure less. And this implies something for Chinese growth, something for Chinese leadership, ambition in the world, something for Chinese Communist Party government. And they understand that what we are doing with Indians is something that is, first of all, a vision of the world. Visions are much more relevant than, how can I say, or not less relevant than facts and statistics. First of all, because visions are for free. So what vision can do in shaping the world is enormous if you think how are cheap. The production of vision is very cheap. If you want to produce a road, you need to put money and so on. But the idea of the Cotton Road is very simple, and it is, okay, you are talking to me, the Chinese, of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road means that this great structure of connecting China, Africa, and Europe, having China as a center. I'm Italian, you are Spaniards. And I think that even here there is the same way of saying, todas las calles llegan a Roma. The Romans didn't build roads for letting the Gauls to go on holiday in Iberia. They build the road, of course, for moving troops, but they build the road because if you build a road and all the roads go to Rome, Rome is the center, and the center makes others peripheries. And the centrality of Rome surviving centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. The idea that Rome was the center. Think about all the Middle Age politics till the beginning of modernity, more or less, in the 14th, 15th centuries. But all the political thinking after the fall of the Roman Empire was to rebuild the Roman Empire, to become the new Roman emperor, even if you were Frank, German, what else. So this was the long-lasting consequences of building roads. And we are saying to the Indians, are you sure that you want to be a station in the Chinese Silk Road? Or you prefer to be the hub of the new network connecting the Western, the richest, the more technological advanced world and the growing Far East? Just a point of vision. So that for saying to you that it's relevant to think about ideas and concepts. So I have no idea. I'm not sure. I don't think that. I can just add one thing. I'm sure that there is no destiny. It's not said that we will have to face a major war or major challenge with China or what else. It depends. It depends. It depends from their moves, our moves. Try to understand and try to find a solution in which we can stay together in some way. Of course, we have to be safer than in the last 30 years, but okay.
Muy bien, thank you very much. And if you don't have, si no tenéis más preguntas, yo concluiría agradeciendo vuestra presencia, vuestro interés y pero sobre todo la presencia, la pericia y la capacidad divulgativa del profesor Parsi. Muchísimas gracias y pido un aplauso para él, por favor.
Muchas gracias a vosotros.
Bene.